People who have been clinically dead and brought back to life. What was your experience? Before we start, welcome back to Reddit Stories Hub. If you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Here we'll be telling you interesting, thought-provoking stories from Reddit. So get comfortable and let's jump right in. Story 1. I was dead for 6 minutes. I was laying on the gurney and I was getting colder. Somewhere, my body started warming up and everything became really calm and peaceful. I was no longer in pain. All the noise from ER just went away. It was really enjoyable. I was thinking about my daughter and I was remembering all the things we had done. Slowly, it was just black and nothing. There was no knowledge of anything. I explain it as it was like before I was born. Then the worst thing in the world is being revived. I start hearing loud noises. I felt this massive pain. Then there was the nastiest stench ever. The smell was like every dead animal had crawled in my nose. The smell was so bad I started vomiting. I remember the doctors turning me on my side and watching my vomit spray on a nurse. Dying was the most pleasant thing I have ever experienced, and being revived the worse. Story 2. I was electrocuted by about 13,800 volts. The doctors say it's likely the first hit stopped my heart, and the second one started it, before I was pulled like a lifeless corpse to safety. I remember experiencing the darkest dark and the most silent silence. I ceased to care that I was dying. Time seemed to change. It could have been hours, it seemed. It was only about 30 seconds. I felt as though I was floating and floated toward something that I eventually realized was my body and reality. Upon joining with whatever it was I was floating towards, I became self-aware in my body and heard the electricity making horrible noises and knew I was in danger. From there, it was a horribly painful experience where I lost most of my toes due to tissue death and had severe electrical burns on all 4 limbs. More surgeries than I care to count, and seeing the round bone ends of my toes that were freshly amputated still haunts me a little. Story 3. There was nothing, just a black void. It happened during my first C-section. I was lying there talking with my husband, waiting to hear our baby girl's first cry, when I started to feel strange. I felt warm, and my vision started to get fuzzy around the edges. I blinked my eyes a few times to see if that would clear my vision, but it did not. All of a sudden, it was like someone turned the volume up, and I could hear my heart monitor perfectly clear. As I'm lying there, I noticed that the space between my heartbeats were becoming more and more spaced out. Then, I hear my husband asking me if I'm okay. He just kept saying, "Baby, are you okay?" over and over. I could not answer him, though. I felt paralyzed. A few minutes before, I had only been numb from the chest down. So, I'm just looking up at the ceiling and noticed that black started creeping in on my vision. I got this overwhelming feeling and knew this was it. I was never going to get to hear my baby girl's first cry, never hold her, or watch her grow up. I would never get to see my husband again. Then, I felt tears rolling down the side of my face. By this time, my vision was almost completely gone. My husband leaned over and wiped my tears, kissed my forehead, then squeezed my hand. I still felt paralyzed, but somehow managed to squeeze his hand back. After that, I slowly faded out to blackness. Now, up to this point, it felt as if time had slowed considerably. Then it sped up. It felt like I was only out for a second before I snapped awake. You know, like when you fall asleep on accident and then jerk awake? That is exactly what it felt like. I could see normally, and the noise around me was back to a normal level. I could also feel the parts of my body that were not numb due to the spinal block. After that, everything went fine. My baby girl was born, and I had to stay in recovery for 3 hours to monitor my blood pressure. My doctor said that I had a bad reaction to the combination of drugs that were put into my spinal block, and I was on my way to a flatline. My husband later told me that after I squeezed his hand, a nurse took him out to the hallway, and he was out there for almost 10 minutes before they let him come back in. He said I was just starting to wake up when he came back in. For me, it seemed like just a few seconds between being out and being awake. I have had 4 other surgeries and have had issues with my blood pressure every time. Never as bad as the first time, though. The doctors and nurses were more prepared given my history. Story 4, not really sure what happened, and it still freaks me out to this day. My daughter was 4 and developed pneumonia. Her breathing would stop in her sleep, so we took her into the emergency room. She was there for a total of 5 days. For the first 3 days, her health kept deteriorating. And on the 3rd day, my girlfriend got a call that her mother had collapsed and was taken to the hospital. She was without oxygen for 20 minutes and was declared brain dead. That night, my daughter woke up and asked about Grandma. No one had said anything to her or in the room with her. We asked her what she meant. She told us that Grandma came to her in a dream and said, "It's not your time yet. I'll go for you." Immediately the next day, she was almost 100% better. Story 5. I was having anaphylaxis, wasn't breathing, and I considered all the hallucinations I experienced likely due to hypoxic episode until I told my mom what I saw. A middle-aged man who wasn't in scrubs standing still at the end of my bed while all staff were running around and doing their business. I was having a non-verbal conversation with him, and he was telling me to calm down, focus on breathing. He wore a tropical-style button-down shirt, one of those old-school newsboys' hats, and had a very pleasant demeanor. Mom showed me a photo of my grandpa that I never had seen before, and it was the guy at the foot of my bed, and he died before I was even born. Story 6. I don't know if this counts, as I don't think I flatlined, but I had a huge postpartum hemorrhage after my second and last child was born. I lost 2.3 liters of blood, which I think is about half of all my blood, and considered the highest classification of blood loss before death occurs. I was given general anesthetic before I passed out on my own, but leading up to that was such a surreal experience. As someone has previously mentioned, there is this sense of acceptance, of laying back and going with it. When I first started bleeding, I was scared and panicking. By the time I was being wheeled into the theater, I was smiling at the midwife and telling her it was going to be okay. I was delirious and euphoric and not scared at all. My vision started to go. At first it was colored spots. Then everything had a gray hue as tunnel vision set in. Sound became muffled, like putting my hands over my ears. The whole time, the general feeling of indifference and no urge to fight it was there. It was so calm, I don't think I've ever computed just how lucky I am to be here. So, a near-death experience by blood loss can confirm not bad. The recovery, though, I felt like shit for weeks and had PTSD. I was so physically weak that I could barely take care of the baby and had to inject myself with anti-clotting meds for 6 weeks every day. Story 7. I had a traumatic brain injury from heat exhaustion. While unconscious, I saw my grandpa. We talked for a while and he said I could go back with him or stay. I looked down and saw myself in that hospital bed with my brother holding my hand. He felt it turn cold, and I never saw him cry that way before. Went back into my body and felt more pain than I knew in my life. Been a year of recovery and I lost most of my memory, but I'm happy. Story 8. This happened well before my girlfriend and I got together, but she intentionally overdosed on methadone and was clinically dead briefly at the hospital. She said she could see the doctors and her husband in the room from above, and then she found herself in a meadow with her first boyfriend just talking, like nothing had happened. Then she felt herself getting pulled out of there abruptly and suddenly sprang up with her eyes wide open and she was back to life. Story 9. I was buried alive in Mexico when I was 7 years old. We were digging tunnels in a sand wall on the beach. It rained the night before, so the sand was a little wet. It all collapsed. Most kids were buried up to their knees, necks, ankles. My stepbrothers thought that my twin sister was lying when she said I came with them that day. They couldn't remember and kept telling her I was staying at home. Before we left the house that day, my sister told me randomly to yell her name, Ashley, if anything happened, and she would hear me. So I remember the tunnel I was working on collapsing, hyperventilating while simultaneously yelling for Ashley, passing out, seeing the white light, more darkness, and waking up over my dad's shoulder. My sister says she heard me screaming. She ran home and got my dad. My dad got all the neighbors. They were all digging with shovels. My dad made them use their hands after a while so they wouldn't hurt me. They found me literally 6 feet under. I was coughing at the time of the collapse, so I had no sand in my lungs because I was covering my mouth. They found my hand sticking up above my body first because I was throwing sand out of my tunnel. My twin sister saw me, and I was blue. My stepmom attempted CPR. The ambulance came and couldn't find a pulse. They used the defibrillator and brought me back to life. I am now 25, totally fine, left the hospital that day, pregnant with a healthy baby boy, and love my twin sister more than anybody in the world. Story 10. One of my old frat brothers was clinically dead for like 40 seconds because of Xanax. He said that he saw himself floating above his body in the hospital room. He said that he could see doctors and nurses working on him and family in the room. He said he slowly floated above the hospital and towards a light. He said the most peaceful feeling he has ever experienced washed over him. This is a person who has done coke in college. He said it's almost impossible to describe the feeling with our vocabulary. He said it feels like a weight was lifted off you. He said he saw some long-gone family in the light, but they told him it wasn't his time. He said he was angry because he felt so good, but floated back down to his body. I have no idea if he is telling the truth, but he is a trustworthy friend. He never used drugs again, Mama. Story 11. Not me, but right before my great-grandma passed. She kept trying to explain these vivid colors and smells. She kept saying how beautiful things were, and she was saying it was unlike anything she ever saw. She was an extremely religious woman. A little while after the colors and smells, she told us, he said we have to say it's okay for her to go. I mean, my whole family was standing around saying goodbye. I vividly remember this, even though I was only 9. Once we all said it was okay, she passed on. Also, the night before, she was talking to herself. We asked her what's going on, and she pointed at the chair across the room and said, "Please don't be rude. I'm having a conversation with her." And we were confused and asked about what, and she said the woman was explaining what we were going to do with our futures. So strange, and I'll never know if it was real or what was happening, but it's kind of cool to think it's real. Story 12. So let me preface this by saying I'm immune compromised, and that's why things went bad fast. A few years ago, I got an abscess in my lower back, and about 4 hours after I started showing symptoms, fever, site inflammation, pain, etc., I started going septic while waiting in the ER. Just started really feeling like shit. After being admitted and already starting on some hardcore broad-spectrum antibiotics, I just wasn't getting better. In fact, I was getting worse, and I felt awful, and it hurt so badly, but nothing showing up on CAT, MRI, or X-ray to suggest an abscess, so they thought it was a skin infection. After about 3 days in, packed with ice bags, my temp was 104.7 and my organs were starting to shut down. It was weird because I went from feeling the most miserable I've ever felt to peace, calm, pain-free, and quiet. I couldn't hear anything, like I had just been put in a soundproof room. I could still see my wife, my mom, and siblings, and they started panicking. I didn't know at the time, but my heart was going into a weird rhythm or something along those lines. I just closed my eyes like I was just going to take a nap. Remember just feeling like I've had a good life? And only being sad I was leaving my wife behind. Only been married 3 years at this point. Remember seeing almost like a foggy haze, like you see in movies where they're by the docks early morning and being told, "Not yet," by a figure in said fog. Woke up a couple hours later, and apparently they got me back and also gave me emergency surgery as the surgeon had a hunch where the abscess was, even though charts didn't show anything. Spent an entire month in the hospital recovering. Bandage changes were a bitch because it was so deep. Thanks to that surgeon and rest of the staff, I'm still here today. Story 13. My heart stopped in a hospital. It was rather unexpected. I was watching the monitor hit 41 BPM, then 0, and all the lines were flat. I had just enough time to say, "Huh?" before losing consciousness. I had a dream that was very short and more disconnected than most dreams. I say confusing, but others may say profound. The content was more or less about what was on my mind at the time and some of my interests. Mostly very familiar stuff. There is nothing after, really. I can see how people could see their life flash before their eyes or see God if that is what was important to them. Story 14. I went into septic shock and organ failure last year. I only remember being wheeled into the ER and then waking up the next day. It was like going to sleep, but it feels like you've been fighting sleep for weeks. I found dying exhausting, weirdly enough. I had no feelings of euphoria, just blackness. I could feel myself dying. I always tell people that my vision was like one of the old-fashioned TVs with tubes, so that when you turn it off, it just kind of shrinks until the image disappears. I also remember breathing being something that I had to make myself do. No more autopilot until I couldn't anymore. I was also profoundly sad at that moment because I felt that I would be missing so much. Also, that I would never see my fiance's face ever again. Story 15. When I was 10, I blacked out while watching TV. When I woke up, I got an intubate to help me breath. This part is according to my dad. Dad did CPR when I blacked out. Got to the hospital while blacked out 20 mins. Doctors were going to pronounce me dead because they tried to revive me for 10 mins. But one intern doctor didn't stop and actually revived me. So I was in the ER for 4 hours to check if my function is going to be okay, brain dead, when cut off at 2 for 5 to 10 minutes. During my death, saw weird stuff. I went to a dark place where the sky is black and felt cold for some reason. When I was going to walk around, I saw a bridge and walked to it. I was was thinking what was going to be the other side of the bridge, so I start walking on it. Before I could finish crossing the bridge, I heard someone calling me. I turned, and then I woke up. That is what happened during that time, and it never felt that long for some reason. I told my friends about this, and they said I walked the Purgatory Bridge, so that's weird. Story 16. It's like sleeping without dreaming, or being put under for surgery where the last thing you remember is the anesthesiologist counting backwards, and the next thing you remember is waking up in the recovery ward. Nothingness, which is not the same thing as blackness or emptiness. When I came back, I felt very disoriented, while also feeling very sure that I was thinking clearly. I kept trying to sit up and get out of bed, felt like I had a million urgent things to do right at that moment, and I kept trying to get up so I could run some errands and brush my teeth. The doctors and nurses had to push me back into bed while saying, "You don't have to do anything, you just died." Story 17. I had a dream, I guess. They told me I was gone for about 30 seconds. I was standing in the middle of a 4-way crossroad, and a disembodied voice asked me which way I wanted to go. I panicked because I didn't have an answer. The voice began laughing, and when I asked what was so funny, they hit me with the defibrillator, and I was back. It hurt like hell. I still have nightmares about it sometimes. Story 18. I was dead for a very short period of time, like 30 seconds to a minute. There's a big misconception about it. It's not like sleeping at all. I'll try to explain. There's always a sort of white noise in the back of my mind. It quiets down when I sleep, but it's still there. I never noticed it before I died, but I do now. I don't want to romanticize death, but when I was out, it was like this perfect nothingness. And nothingness is so hard to imagine normally. But once you experience it, and they bring you back, part of your wish is you could have stayed. There are no positive feelings there, obviously, but it takes away everything bad too. All your stress, the nightmares, the troubles, all gone. Just nothing exists. It's beautiful in a way. I'm not suicidal at all and hope to live the rest of a long and happy life, but I'm very much looking forward to a lack of consciousness when I do eventually pass again, and I can honestly say I don't fear death anymore. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.